The frozen silence of the Ardennes forest shattered at 5:30 in the morning on December 16, 1944, as 2,000 German artillery pieces erupted in unison along an 85-mile front. Snow-laden pine trees trembled under the thunderous barrage that would mark the beginning of Adolf Hitler's final desperate offensive in the West. Operation Watch on the Rhine. Private First Class James Mitchell of the 106th Infantry Division pressed his face against the icy earth of his foxhole as shells screamed overhead, their orange flashes illuminating the winter darkness like deadly fireworks. The 20-year-old farm boy from Iowa had been told this was a quiet sector, a place where green troops could get their feet wet without facing the full fury of German resistance. That comfortable lie was now buried under the avalanche of steel raining down upon the American positions. 3 miles to the north, Lieutenant Colonel Jochen Piper adjusted his field glasses and surveyed the chaos his Kampfgruppe had unleashed. The 30-year-old Waffen-SS commander, leading the spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, knew this was Germany's last chance to change the course of the war. Behind him, 117 tanks and assault guns waited in the pre-dawn gloom, their engines idling like mechanical beasts eager for the hunt. Hitler's plan was audacious beyond measure. The Führer envisioned his forces punching through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes, racing 90 miles to capture the vital port of Antwerp, and splitting the Allied armies in two. If successful, the operation would force the Americans and British to negotiate a separate peace, allowing Germany to turn its full attention to the Soviet advance in the east. It was a gambler's throw of the dice when Germany had nothing left to lose. The German buildup had been masterful in its secrecy. For weeks, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt had concentrated 250,000 troops and nearly 1,000 tanks in the forests east of the Ardennes, moving only at night and maintaining strict radio silence. American intelligence, focused on their own offensive preparations in other sectors, had missed the signs entirely. The 8th Corps, stretched thin across the supposedly quiet Ardennes sector, would bear the full brunt of Germany's last great offensive. As referenced in Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive analysis in Citizen Soldiers, the American forces occupying the Ardennes were a mixture of battle-weary veterans recuperating from earlier campaigns and untested units receiving their baptism of fire. The dense forests and rolling hills that had historically served as an invasion corridor into France were now about to witness one of the most brutal winter battles in American military history. Captain Robert Hayes of the 28th Infantry Division watched through his binoculars as shadowy figures emerged from the tree line across the valley. The veteran of Normandy and the Hurtgen Forest recognized the distinctive silhouettes of German Tiger and Panther tanks, their long guns already seeking targets among the American positions. His radio crackled with reports from along the line. The Germans were attacking everywhere simultaneously, and the thin American defenses were beginning to crack under the pressure. The morning mist that clung to the forest floor seemed to carry with it the weight of destiny. In the coming days, this quiet corner of Belgium and Luxembourg would become the stage for the largest battle fought by American forces during World War II, a desperate struggle that would determine not just the outcome of the war, but the fate of democracy itself in Western Europe. The German avalanche rolled forward with devastating momentum as dawn broke gray and cold over the Ardennes. Kampfgruppe Piper, spearheading the advance of the 6th Panzer Army, carved through American positions like a steel blade through paper. The young SS officers' battle group of tanks, half-tracks, and motorized infantry had one objective: reach the Meuse River bridges before Allied reinforcements could seal the breach. Staff Sergeant William Thompson of the 14th Cavalry Group found himself in the eye of the storm as German forces overran his observation post near Losheim Gap. The veteran NCO had fought his way across North Africa and Sicily, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of an entire armored division emerging from the morning fog. His desperate radio call, "We're being overrun, tanks everywhere," would be among the last transmissions from the northern shoulder of what would soon be known as the Bulge. By noon on December 16th, the scope of the German offensive became clear to Allied commanders. 3 entire German armies, the 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel, the 6th Panzer Army commanded by SS General Josef Dietrich, and the 7th Army led by General Erich Brandenberger, were pushing westward on a front stretching from Monschau in the north to Echternach in the south. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, initially dismissed the attack as a limited spoiling offensive designed to disrupt Allied preparations for their own winter campaign. From his headquarters in Luxembourg City, the usually astute Bradley failed to grasp that Hitler had committed his last strategic reserves to this single throw of the dice. It would take precious hours before the true magnitude of the crisis became apparent. The German plan unfolded with mechanical precision in those first crucial hours. While Piper's armored spearhead drove toward the vital fuel depot at Stavelot, other battle groups fanned out across the Ardennes countryside seeking to exploit gaps in the American lines. The objective was speed above all. German commanders knew their window of opportunity would close rapidly once Allied air power and reinforcements entered the battle. Major Harold Williams, operations officer for the 110th Infantry Regiment, watched helplessly as his positions crumbled under the German assault. The regiment, part of the 28th Infantry Division's defensive line, had been spread impossibly thin across a 25-mile front. Individual companies found themselves isolated and surrounded as German armor bypassed strong points and drove deep into the rear areas. The weather proved to be Germany's most valuable ally in those opening days. Thick clouds and freezing fog grounded the mighty Allied air forces that had dominated European skies since D-Day. Stripped of their aerial umbrella, American ground forces faced German panzers on equal terms for the first time in months. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Soldiers who had grown accustomed to Allied air superiority suddenly found themselves naked under gray winter skies. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, artillery commander of the 101st Airborne Division, received urgent orders to move his unit from reserve positions near Reims to the critical road junction at Bastogne. The paratroopers, still recovering from their grueling campaign in Holland during Operation Market Garden, would find themselves rushed into battle aboard hastily assembled truck convoys, racing against time to reach the key transportation hub before German spearheads could seize it. As darkness fell on the first day of the offensive, German forces had achieved penetrations of up to 12 miles in several sectors. Thousands of American soldiers found themselves cut off behind enemy lines while entire units simply vanished in the confusion of the German breakthrough. Radio networks collapsed under the strain, leaving commanders at all levels to make critical decisions based on fragmentary and often contradictory information. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in military history, as the hunters became the hunted, and Germany's last offensive gamble transformed into America's greatest test of the European war. The second day of the offensive dawned with temperatures plummeting below zero and snow beginning to fall across the battlefield. German momentum continued unabated as Kampfgruppe Piper pushed deeper into Allied territory, leaving a trail of destruction and controversy that would echo through history. Near the village of Malmedy, Piper's advance guard encountered a convoy of American troops from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, setting the stage for one of the war's most notorious incidents. Technical Sergeant Kenneth Ahrens watched in horror as German SS troops herded captured American soldiers into a field near the Café Boderway. The veteran artillery observer, wounded but still conscious, lay among the bodies as machine gun fire erupted from the German positions. 84 American prisoners of war were gunned down in what would become known as the Malmedy Massacre, an atrocity that would steel American resolve and eliminate any possibility of quarter being given in the battles to come. Word of the massacre spread rapidly through American units, transforming what had begun as shock and confusion into cold, determined fury. Captain Robert Cohen of the 30th Infantry Division received the news as his unit rushed northward to help stem the German advance. The Jewish-American officer from Brooklyn understood that this was no longer just another battle. It had become a fight for the very soul of civilization. Meanwhile, in the strategic town of Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe found himself surrounded by 4 German divisions as the enemy forces bypassed the stubborn American garrison. The 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division and other units, had arrived just in time to transform Bastogne into an impregnable fortress. The paratroopers, nicknamed the Screaming Eagles, dug in among the frozen ground and prepared for a siege that would test their legendary resilience. As documented in Charles MacDonald's authoritative account, A Time for Trumpets, the defense of Bastogne became symbolic of American determination in the face of overwhelming odds. The town sat at the center of 7 major roads, making its capture essential for German logistics. Without Bastogne's road network, the German offensive would bog down in the narrow country lanes of the Ardennes, unable to support the armored spearheads racing toward the Meuse. Colonel Hurley Fuller, commanding the 110th Infantry Regiment, coordinated the defense of Clairvaux Castle as German forces surrounded the medieval fortress. The Ohio National Guard unit had been decimated in the initial assault, but survivors continued to resist from the castle's ancient walls. Fuller's radio calls grew increasingly desperate as ammunition ran low, and German tanks systematically reduced his positions to rubble. The human cost of the battle became apparent as field hospitals throughout the region overflowed with casualties. Major Patricia Murphy, a nurse with the 44th Evacuation Hospital, worked tirelessly to treat wounded soldiers as German artillery shells landed dangerously close to the medical tents. The Red Cross markings that should have provided protection seemed meaningless in the chaos of the German advance. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, finally grasped the magnitude of the crisis during a conference at his headquarters in Versailles on December 19th. The normally optimistic Eisenhower realized that Hitler had committed everything to this single offensive, and the outcome would determine the fate of the entire European campaign. He immediately began shifting reserves from across the front, stripping other sectors of troops to contain the German breakthrough. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams of the 4th Armored Division received orders to break through to the besieged garrison at Bastogne. The tank commander, whose reputation for aggressive action had been forged in the breakout from Normandy, understood that time was critical. Every hour of delay meant more American casualties and a greater chance of German success. As the 3rd day of the offensive dawned, the weather remained Germany's ally. Heavy snow and freezing fog continued to ground Allied aircraft, while German forces pushed ever closer to their ultimate objective, the Meuse River and the port of Antwerp beyond. The fate of the Allied cause in Europe hung in the balance as American forces struggled to contain the greatest military crisis they had faced since Pearl Harbor. December 20th, 1944, marked the high water mark of German ambitions in the Battle of the Bulge. Kampfgruppe Piper, now critically short on fuel, ground to a halt just 4 miles from the Meuse River near the village of Stoumont. The SS colonel who had led the deepest German penetration found himself trapped between determined American defenders and his own success. His rapid advance had outrun his supply lines. Major Hal McCown of the 30th Infantry Division's 2nd Battalion found himself captured during the fierce fighting around Stoumont, becoming an unwilling witness to the collapse of German hopes. From his captivity among Piper's headquarters, the American officer observed the growing desperation of his captors as ammunition and fuel supplies dwindled. The vaunted German war machine was literally running out of gas within sight of its objective. In Bastogne, the siege reached its climax as German forces launched coordinated attacks from all directions. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting division commander, had already delivered his legendary response to German surrender demands. Nuts. The single word, transmitted by Colonel Joseph Harper to confused German negotiators, became a symbol of American defiance that resonated far beyond the frozen foxholes of Belgium. Staff Sergeant Paul Miller of the 515th Parachute Infantry Regiment crouched in a snow-filled foxhole on the Bastogne perimeter as German Tiger tanks approached through the morning mist. The veteran paratrooper from Chicago had jumped into Normandy and Holland, but the defense of Bastogne would prove to be his greatest test. With bazooka rockets in short supply and German armor dominating the battlefield, American defenders relied on courage, ingenuity, and the stubborn refusal to surrender that characterized their airborne training. The weather, which had been Germany's greatest ally in the opening phases of the offensive, began to shift on December 22nd. High-pressure systems moving in from the Atlantic started to clear the persistent cloud cover that had grounded Allied air power for 6 crucial days. Fighter-bomber pilots at bases across France and England waited anxiously for the first break in the weather that would allow them to support their besieged comrades. Captain Robert Johnson, of the 9th Air Force's 67th Tactical Reconnaissance Group, flew one of the first sorties as visibility improved over the battlefield. From his cockpit at 8,000 feet, the pilot could see the full scope of the German offensive: roads clogged with enemy vehicles, supply columns stretching back toward the German border, and the telltale signs of a military force that had overextended itself in pursuit of an impossible objective. General George Patton, commanding the Third Army, had been moving north from his positions in Lorraine since December 20th, executing one of the most remarkable strategic pivots in military history. The flamboyant commander had turned an entire army 90 degrees and was driving toward Bastogne with a speed that amazed even his own staff officers. Patton's 4th Armored Division, led by Brigadier General Hugh Gaffey, formed the spearhead of this relief effort. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams pushed his Combat Command B through snow-clogged roads toward the besieged garrison, his Sherman, tanks struggling against both German resistance and the brutal winter weather. The advance was measured in yards rather than miles, as determined German defenders contested every village and crossroads along the route. Abrams knew that thousands of American lives depended on his ability to break through the German ring around Bastogne. As referenced in John Eisenhower's detailed study, The Bitter Woods, the psychological momentum of the battle began to shift on December 23rd, when clear skies finally allowed Allied air power to enter the fray. Hundreds of transport aircraft dropped desperately needed supplies to the Bastogne garrison, while fighter bombers began systematically destroying German vehicles caught in the open on the snow-covered roads. Colonel William Roberts of the 10th Armored Division, defending the southern approaches to Bastogne, watched as parachutes blossomed across the winter sky like exotic flowers. Medical supplies, ammunition, and food rained down on the besieged defenders, providing both material support and a tremendous boost to morale. The message was clear. They had not been abandoned, and help was on the way. The tide of battle was turning, but the outcome remained uncertain as German forces made one final, desperate attempt to capture Bastogne and salvage their offensive before Allied reinforcements could arrive in overwhelming numbers. Christmas Day, 1944, dawned crisp and clear over the Ardennes, marking the beginning of the end. For Hitler's last gamble in the West, the weather that had protected German forces during the opening phase of the offensive now became their nemesis as Allied fighter bombers swarmed over the battlefield like angry hornets. The clear skies that allowed supply drops to the besieged garrison at Bastogne also provided perfect visibility for American pilots hunting German armor. Lieutenant Robert Sharp of the 10th Armored Division's Combat Command B peered through the periscope of his Sherman tank as German Panzer Grenadiers launched another assault on the Bastogne perimeter. The 23-year-old officer from Detroit had been fighting continuously for 9 days, surviving on catnaps and cold K rations, while his undermanned unit held critical positions along the defensive ring. Christmas morning brought no respite from the carnage, only the distant sound of aircraft engines that promised relief was coming. Brigadier General Hugh Gaffey's 4th Armored Division pressed northward through the villages of Neufchâteau and Cibray, encountering stiffening German resistance with each mile gained. The relief columns faced a deadly gauntlet of anti-tank guns, Panzerfaust teams, and dug-in infantry determined to prevent any link-up with the Bastogne garrison. Every farmhouse became a fortress, every hedgerow a killing ground in the bitter struggle for each yard of frozen ground. Major William Desaubry, commanding the 20th Armored Infantry Battalion inside Bastogne, organized his mixed force of tankers, paratroopers, and artillery observers for what might be the final German assault. The 26-year-old West Point graduate had been wounded twice since the siege began, but refused evacuation, knowing that his leadership was crucial to maintaining the integrity of the defense. His battalion, reduced to less than half strength, held the vital crossroads that controlled access to Bastogne from the north. The German High Command, recognizing that their window of opportunity was rapidly closing, threw everything available into one last attempt to break American resistance. General Heinrich von Luttwitz's 47th Panzer Corps launched coordinated attacks from multiple directions, while the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division attempted to storm the town center. The fighting reached a crescendo of violence as German and American forces grappled in brutal close combat among the rubble-strewn streets. Staff Sergeant Anthony Santoro of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment led his squad in a desperate counterattack to retake a key intersection that German forces had overrun during the night. The veteran paratrooper from Boston, fighting with a Thompson submachine gun liberated from a German supply depot, knew that losing this position would split the American defense in half. His 12-man squad faced an entire company of panzer, grenadiers and house-to-house fighting that left both sides bloodied but unbroken. At precisely 4:46 in the afternoon on December 26th, the 1st Sherman tank of Lieutenant Charles Bogus's Company D, 37th Tank Battalion, smashed through German positions southwest of Bastogne and made contact with elements of the 101st Airborne Division. The link-up, achieved after 7 days of siege, marked the beginning of the German retreat and the effective end of Operation Watch on the Rhine as an offensive operation. As documented in Gerald Astor's comprehensive oral history, A Blood-Dimmed Tide, the relief of Bastogne became a symbol of American resilience that resonated far beyond the immediate battlefield. General McAuliffe's famous reply of nuts to German surrender demands had captured the imagination of the American public, providing a rallying cry during the darkest moment of the European campaign. Colonel Joseph Harper, who had actually delivered McAuliffe's defiant message to the German negotiators, later reflected on the moment that crystallized American determination. The simple word that the German officers couldn't translate had become synonymous with the stubborn courage that characterized the American fighting man. Harper watched as German forces began withdrawing under pressure from both the Bastogne, Garrison and Patton's relief columns, their offensive power finally broken against the anvil of American resolve. Captain James Hendricks of the 94th Infantry Division observed the German retreat from his position north of the town, noting the dejected appearance of enemy soldiers who just days before had been confident of victory. The captain from Eaga, Tennessee, recognized that something fundamental had changed in the character of the war. The German army that had terrorized Europe for 5 years was finally showing signs of collapse. The ring around Bastogne was broken, but the Battle of the Bulge was far from over, as Allied forces prepared to eliminate the dangerous salient that German forces had driven into their lines. The final week of December 1944 witnessed the transformation of the Battle of the Bulge from a German offensive into an Allied counterattack, designed to eliminate the dangerous salient that enemy forces had carved into American lines. General Omar Bradley, initially caught off guard by the scope of the German assault, now saw an opportunity to destroy entire German divisions trapped west of their original positions with inadequate supplies and no hope of reinforcement. Lieutenant Colonel John Miller of the 82nd Airborne Division planned his assault on the village of Chenu as part of the broader Allied effort to reduce the northern shoulder of the Bulge. The paratroop commander, a veteran of Sicily and Normandy, understood that the Germans defending these positions were no longer the confident soldiers who had launched the offensive 2 weeks earlier. Ammunition shortages, fuel starvation, and constant air attacks had reduced many German units to shadows of their former strength. Kampfgruppe Piper, still trapped near Stoumont with no hope of rescue or resupply, prepared for a desperate breakout attempt. SS Lieutenant Colonel Jochen Piper, the aggressive commander who had spearheaded the German drive toward the Meuse, now faced the prospect of abandoning his heavy equipment and attempting to infiltrate back to German lines on foot. The young officer who had epitomized German offensive capability was reduced to planning a retreat that would end his military career. Major Hal McCown, still a prisoner of Piper's battle group, watched as German morale crumbled under the pressure of constant Allied attacks. The American officer observed German soldiers openly questioning their officers' decisions and expressing doubts about the war's outcome. The psychological transformation was as dramatic as the military situation. The supposedly fanatical SS troops were behaving like beaten men rather than Nazi supermen. General Courtney Hodges, commanding the First Army, coordinated the assault on the northern face of the Bulge, while General Patton's Third Army continued its drive from the south. The pincer movement was designed to trap German forces in a pocket, where they could be systematically destroyed by superior Allied firepower. Hodges, initially criticized for the weakness of his Ardennes defenses, now had the opportunity to redeem his reputation through aggressive offensive action. Captain Robert Merriam of the 2nd Infantry Division led his company in the attack on German positions near the village of Dom-Bütgenbach, where American forces had established a crucial strongpoint during the early days of the offensive. The Big Red One, reinforced by elements of other divisions, had held this vital position against repeated German assaults, preventing enemy forces from widening their breakthrough toward the north. The weather continued to favor Allied operations, as clear skies allowed maximum utilization of American air power. Fighter bombers of the 9th Air Force flew hundreds of sorties daily, systematically destroying German vehicles, caught on roads made impassable by snow and ice. The Luftwaffe, reduced to a handful of operational aircraft, could offer no meaningful opposition to the aerial armada that dominated the skies over the battlefield. Colonel Bruce Clark of the 7th Armored Division coordinated the defense of St. Vith, the communications hub that had anchored the northern shoulder of the American line throughout the German offensive. Clark's Combat Command B had fought a magnificent delaying action that prevented German forces from exploiting their initial breakthrough, buying precious time for Allied reinforcements to arrive and contain the enemy advance. As detailed in Charles Whiting's analysis, The Battle of the Bulge, the German retreat accelerated after January 1st, 1945, when Hitler finally authorized a general withdrawal to more defensible positions. The Führer's belated recognition that his offensive had failed came too late to save the divisions trapped in the Ardennes salient, where Allied forces were systematically reducing German combat strength through constant attacks and interdiction of supply lines. Sergeant Michael O'Brien of the 4th Infantry Division observed the German withdrawal from his position near the Our River, noting the contrast between the confident troops who had launched the offensive and the demoralized soldiers now stumbling back toward the German border. The veteran NCO from Boston recognized that something fundamental had changed in the character of German resistance. The enemy who had terrorized Europe was finally showing signs of complete collapse. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges received reports from across his front indicating that German resistance was weakening rapidly as enemy forces attempted to withdraw from their exposed positions in the Bulge. The First Army commander, working closely with Montgomery's forces attacking from the north, prepared for a final offensive that would restore the original Allied lines and eliminate the threat to the port of Antwerp. The stage was set for the final act of the drama that had begun with such promise for German arms just 3 weeks earlier. By January 25, 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was officially over, as Allied forces restored their original lines along the German border. What had begun as Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied armies had ended as Germany's final strategic defeat in Western Europe. The cost had been enormous: 19,000 American dead, 47,000 wounded, and 23,000 missing or captured. But the ultimate victory was complete and decisive. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams of the 4th Armored Division surveyed the battlefield near Bastogne, where his tanks had broken through to relieve the besieged garrison 3 weeks earlier. The ground was littered with the debris of war, burned out tanks, abandoned equipment, and hastily dug graves marking where brave men from both sides had fallen in the snow. Abrams, destined to become one of America's greatest military leaders, understood that he had participated in one of the pivotal moments of the 20th century. General George Patton, never one for modesty, declared that the relief of Bastogne represented the finest hour of American arms in the European theater. The flamboyant commander had indeed achieved something remarkable, turning an entire army 90 degrees in the middle of winter and driving over 100 miles through enemy territory to rescue a surrounded garrison. His Third Army's performance during the Bulge operation would become the stuff of military legend. The human cost of Hitler's offensive became apparent as Graves registration units began the grim task of identifying and burying the dead from both sides. Captain Patricia Murphy, the Army nurse who had tended wounded soldiers throughout the battle, reflected on the terrible price of war as she walked through the temporary cemeteries that dotted the Ardennes landscape. The young men buried beneath simple wooden crosses had given their lives to preserve freedom in Europe, and their sacrifice would not be forgotten. SS Lieutenant Colonel Jochen Piper, the architect of the Malmedy massacre and commander of the deepest German penetration, was captured during the final days of the battle, as his exhausted troops surrendered to overwhelming Allied forces. The young officer who had embodied Nazi aggression would face war crimes trials for his actions during the offensive, becoming a symbol of the brutal nature of the conflict that was finally drawing to a close. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, whose defiant nuts had become synonymous with American determination, was promoted and decorated for his leadership during the siege of Bastogne. The artillery officer who had never expected to command infantry in combat had demonstrated that American soldiers could match any enemy in courage and tenacity when properly led and motivated. The strategic implications of the German defeat were immediately apparent to military analysts on both sides. Hitler had committed his last reserves to an operation that gained nothing but cost Germany 47,000 casualties and hundreds of irreplaceable tanks and aircraft. The offensive had also delayed the planned Allied spring campaign by several weeks, but this tactical success was overshadowed by the complete destruction of Germany's mobile reserves. As referenced in Russell Wiley's definitive study, Eisenhower's Lieutenants, the Battle of the Bulge marked the moment when German military capability finally collapsed under the weight of Allied material superiority and tactical innovation. The Wehrmacht that had conquered most of Europe in 1940 through 1942 was finished as an offensive force, reduced to conducting a fighting withdrawal that could only delay the inevitable. Colonel William Roberts of the 10th Armored Division, who had helped organize the initial defense of Bastogne, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions during the siege. The veteran tank commander understood that the battle had demonstrated something crucial about American character. When faced with seemingly impossible odds, ordinary citizens could achieve extraordinary things through courage, determination, and mutual support. The weather that had played such a crucial role in the battle's outcome finally cleared permanently in late January, allowing Allied forces to resume their planned offensive toward the Rhine River. The delay caused by Hitler's offensive had been costly but not decisive. Germany lacked the resources to exploit the time gained, while Allied industrial capacity continued to produce the weapons and supplies needed for final victory. Private First Class James Mitchell of the 106th Infantry Division, who had survived the initial German bombardment that opened the battle, reflected on his experiences as he prepared for the final assault on Germany itself. The young soldier from Iowa had witnessed the worst that war could offer, but had also seen the best of human nature in the courage and sacrifice of his fellow Americans. The Battle of the Bulge had indeed become a turning point in World War II's Endgame, but not in the way Hitler had envisioned. Instead of splitting the Allied armies and forcing a negotiated peace, the German offensive had consumed the last reserves available for the defense of the Reich. The road to Berlin was now open, and the end of the war in Europe was simply a matter of time. The legacy of the battle would endure long after the last shots were fired, a testament to the courage of ordinary soldiers who refuse to surrender when faced with overwhelming odds, and a reminder that democracy's strength lies not in its weapons but in the character of the people willing to defend it.